My name is Melissa Grant, and I'm 36 years old. 9 days after I brought my son home from the hospital, my mother stood in my living room, pointed at the bassinet, and told me to have it packed by the weekend. My brother's family needed the space more than a newborn did, she said, and I was the one who always figured things out. There was a piece of paper sitting in a drawer 11 feet from where she stood that would have changed the entire tone of that conversation. She didn't know it existed. I did. And what that paper made possible 3 weeks later is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. Welcome to Quiet Reckonings, where the people who never raised their voice finally get to finish the sentence. If stories about family, property, and the exact moment someone stops absorbing the blame speak to you, stay through this one, because the ending isn't what you'll expect. Before you understand the living room, you need to understand the house. I'm a structural engineer. I inspect buildings for a living. I tell contractors when a beam won't hold and when a foundation is lying about its own age. It's a strange skill to bring into a family, because you start noticing which walls in your own life were never load-bearing to begin with, just painted to look like they were holding something up. I bought my house 4 years ago, at 32, using an inheritance nobody in my family knew the size of. My grandmother, my father's mother, not my mother's, left me a modest but real sum when she passed, specifically to me. Specifically in a will she had a lawyer draft twice to make sure it was airtight. She'd watched how my mother operated for 60 years. She knew exactly what she was protecting. I used that money as a down payment on a 2-story house on Larkspur Court, put the rest into renovations myself, evenings and weekends, learning to hang drywall from videos because I refused to owe anyone labor either. My name is the only name on the deed. Not joint, not shared. Mine, notarized, recorded at the county clerk's office on a Thursday in April, 4 years ago exactly. My mother, Carol, different family, same name as apparently every difficult mother in these stories, which tells you something about how common this particular pattern is, never asked whose name was on anything. She simply started calling it the family house within 8 months of my moving in, the same way she'd renamed my car the good car the family used when hers broke down. The same way she'd renamed my Christmas bonus the emergency fund the year my brother's transmission failed. I want to be clear about my brother, Marcus, because he's not a cartoon villain in this story. He's 39, he's had a rough stretch, a divorce, a layoff, 2 years of bad luck stacked on top of each other like a losing hand nobody dealt him fairly. I have sympathy for him. What I don't have sympathy for is how our mother used his bad luck as a lever against my life, without ever once asking either of us if that was something we actually wanted. My son, Theo, was born on a Tuesday in early September, 6 days late and furious about it, 9 pounds of pure indignation. His father and I share custody, but don't share a house. An amicable split, finalized before Theo arrived, and, honestly, the smoothest part of this entire year. So it was me and my best friend Priya in the delivery room, and then it was me alone in a quiet house at 3 in the morning, doing the math every new parent does in the dark. Am I going to be able to do this? My mother came to help. I want to give her that. She brought casseroles. She did 3 loads of laundry. She held Theo so I could sleep for stretches longer than 90 minutes for the first time in a week. But somewhere around day 6, the help started coming with conditions attached the way water finds cracks. She rearranged my pantry. She had opinions about my pediatrician's advice on swaddling. She mentioned, twice, that the nursery, which I'd painted a pale sage green the month before, would make a perfectly good guest room if I ever needed the space back. I didn't think much of it. New mothers are told to pick their battles, and I was picking sleep over pantry organization every single time. Then, on day 9, my mother sat down across from me at my own kitchen table, waited until Theo was actually asleep in my arms, and made her announcement with the calm of someone reading out a grocery list. Marcus and his 2 kids would be moving in by the 15th. He'd lost the lease on his apartment, a fact I hadn't even known yet, and my mother had already decided, on his behalf and mine, that the solution was for him to take the master bedroom and for me to find a rental, since a young mother with 1 baby needs a lot less space than a father with 2 kids and nowhere else to go. I laughed. Actually laughed. One confused syllable, because it genuinely did not compute as a real sentence. It was real. I said, "Mom, this is my house. My name's on the deed." And she gave me the look she'd been giving me since I was 11. Patient, faintly disappointed, like I'd said something rude at a funeral, and said the sentence I will remember on my deathbed. "Melissa, you've always been the one who figures things out. Marcus has kids who need stability. You'll land somewhere." 9 days postpartum, my son asleep against my chest, and my own mother had just informed me that my house, my name, my 4 years of drywall dust and mortgage payments weighed less on her scale than her son's convenience. I did what a lifetime of training had built into me. I said nothing in the moment. I let her finish her coffee. I let her leave. And then, once the door closed, I sat very still in my kitchen and felt something shift in my chest that had never shifted before. Not anger exactly, something colder and more useful than anger. Clarity. That night, I called my grandmother's old lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Arnav Bhatt, who had handled her estate and who, it turned out, still had my file. I asked him one question. If my mother or brother tried to establish residency in my home against my wishes, what would that actually take to reverse, legally, cleanly, without a courtroom drama dragging on for a year? His answer was almost boring in how simple it was. "You own it outright. You never added anyone to the deed. You've never signed a lease agreement with them. There's no tenancy to establish. If they move in without your consent, you treat it exactly like you'd treat a stranger who wouldn't leave. Because legally, that's what they are." I hadn't expected relief to feel so quiet, but it did. Here is where the story takes its first real turn. The part that made this different from every version of this story I'd heard from other women in similar rooms. My mother had, without telling me, already told my brother the move-in was settled. She'd told him a date. She'd told her sister, my Aunt Renata, that Melissa's coming around to it. She just needs a minute. She had built an entire narrative in which my consent was a formality still catching up to a decision that had already been made. So, on day 12, I sent one email. Not a phone call, not a kitchen conversation, an email, because I wanted a timestamp. To my mother and my brother both. It said, plainly, "Marcus and his children are welcome to stay with me temporarily while he looks for housing, for up to 30 days, under specific house rules I'm attaching. This is not a permanent arrangement. This is not a transfer of any kind, and I need a written yes to these terms by Friday, or the offer is withdrawn. I attached actual house rules: quiet hours given a newborn in the house, a cleaning rotation, a firm date, day 30, after which Marcus needed his own lease secured. I was trying, genuinely, to build a bridge that didn't collapse under me. My mother's response arrived within the hour, and it wasn't to me. It was a screenshot sent to my Aunt Renata, who then, because family group chats are never as private as anyone thinks, forwarded it back to me by accident, thinking she was forwarding it to my cousin. In it, my mother had written, "She's being dramatic with rules and deadlines like we're renting a hotel room from her. This is still the family house, whether she wants to admit it or not. Once Marcus and the boys are actually in there, she won't have the heart to make them leave. Read that again. Once they're actually in there, she won't have the heart to make them leave." My own mother's plan, in her own words, forwarded to me by mistake, was to use my empathy as the mechanism to override my ownership. Move first, negotiate never. That accidental forward changed everything about how I proceeded, because it told me this was never going to be solved with reasonable emails. She wasn't confused about whose house it was. She knew. She was counting on the fact that once real children were sleeping under my roof, I'd absorb the cost the way I always had. So I stopped negotiating and started documenting. I photographed the pantry, the nursery, every room, dated and time-stamped, the week before anyone arrived. I forwarded Arnav's guidance to myself in writing, a paper trail of my own diligence. And I installed a video doorbell, not dramatic, just practical, the kind any homeowner might install, 2 days before the 15th. Marcus arrived on the 15th with his 2 boys, 8 and 11, a moving truck, and my mother riding shotgun in his car, like a general accompanying troops to the front. What Marcus did not arrive with was any acknowledgement of the 30-day terms I'd sent in writing, terms he had never actually agreed to, only received. I let them in. I want to be honest about that choice, because some people watching this will think it was a mistake. It wasn't. I let them in because I meant what I said about temporary shelter for 2 kids who hadn't chosen any of this. But I let them in with the doorbell recording, the photographs dated, and a folder, physical, printed, sitting in my desk drawer, containing the deed, the mortgage statement, and a printed copy of that forwarded text message. The first 2 weeks were almost fine. Almost. My mother, however, could not resist what she considered a victory lap. She began describing the arrangement to relatives as permanent. She told my aunt that Melissa finally came to her senses. She moved a box of her own belongings into my hall closet, unasked, the closet where I kept Theo's out-of-season clothes. When I found it and moved the box to the garage, she called it cruel after everything Marcus is going through. On day 28, 2 days before my deadline, I asked Marcus, calmly and privately, without our mother in the room, whether he had a lease lined up. He admitted he hadn't looked. He admitted our mother had told him not to worry about it, that she'd handle Melissa. That sentence, she'd handle Melissa, was the second turn in this story, because it told me my own brother had been informed, explicitly, that I was an obstacle to be managed, rather than a sister whose home this actually was. On day 30, I did not raise my voice. I did not call a family meeting. I printed one letter addressed to my mother and my brother, and I taped it to the inside of the front door where they'd see it walking out that morning. It stated, in the same plain language as my original email, that the 30-day guest period had ended the prior evening, that I loved my nephews and wished my brother well in finding stable housing, and that as of 6 p.m. that day, the locks would be changed. My mother's response was to laugh in my face, literally standing in my kitchen, and say, "You wouldn't dare lock out your own nephews." Here's the detail that matters, the one piece of quiet planning nobody else in that kitchen knew about. 2 days earlier, I had already contacted a local family shelter transition program through the county, the kind of resource that exists specifically to help someone in Marcus's situation, with children, find fast-tracked emergency housing. I hadn't done it to punish him. I'd done it because I understood something my mother refused to. Help that comes with an eviction date attached still has to include an actual landing pad, or it isn't help, it's just cruelty with better lighting. I told my brother, privately, that afternoon, that a 2-bedroom unit through the county program had a vacancy specifically because of a call I'd made using my professional contacts from inspection work in that same housing complex. It was available the next morning. Not perfect, not permanent, but real, safe, and his. Marcus looked at me for a long moment in that kitchen, and something in his face changed. He said, quietly, "She told me you'd never actually go through with the locks. She said you always cave." And I said, "I know she did. That's not new information. What's new is that I found you somewhere to land, instead of just proving her wrong for the sake of it." That's the version of this story I want people to sit with, because it isn't just about a mother who overstepped. It's about the fact that setting a boundary and abandoning someone are not the same act, no matter how badly the person breaking the boundary wants to convince you they are. My mother did not see it that way. When she realized Marcus intended to actually move into the county unit the next morning, she turned the full weight of her disappointment onto me in the driveway, in front of both boys, saying I had torn this family apart over a house, and that I would regret this when I needed something someday. I said one sentence back, calm, the kind of calm I only found once clarity had fully replaced anger. I said, "I didn't tear anything apart. I just stopped pretending your plans were my obligations." She didn't have an answer for that. She got in Marcus's truck, and they left the next morning as scheduled, my nephews waving at me from the back seat in a way that told me they, at least, understood I hadn't done anything to them. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't even the middle. For the first 2 weeks after they left, my house felt strange in a way I hadn't expected. Not peaceful, exactly. More like the ringing silence after a fire alarm finally stops. Theo and I fell into a rhythm that was ours alone for the first time since he'd been born. No opinions about swaddling technique drifting in from the next room. No footsteps on the stairs that weren't mine. I told myself the hard part was over. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet, and for those 2 weeks, not knowing felt like a gift. Then, 4 weeks after Marcus and my mother drove away, a certified letter arrived at my house, the kind you have to sign for on your own doorstep, and my stomach dropped before I'd even opened it, because nobody sends good news certified. It was from a lawyer named Gregory Paulson on behalf of my mother, and it contained a claim so strange I had to read it 3 times standing in my own entryway before I understood what she was actually trying to do. She was arguing, through counsel, that she had made substantial and ongoing financial and material contributions to the property over the past 4 years, contributions that entitled her to what the letter called an equitable interest in the home, separate from whatever the deed technically said. Attached were photographs, printed and labeled like exhibits in a trial. My mother, standing in my kitchen holding a paint roller the weekend I'd repainted the hallway 2 summers ago. My mother, at the hardware store beside me, the day I bought the drywall supplies, captured mid-sentence, clearly unaware or unbothered that the photo would later be used this way. A receipt for $140 of groceries she'd bought the week Theo was born, highlighted in yellow. A note, handwritten, claiming she had personally paid a contractor $200 in cash for supervisory labor on the nursery, a claim I knew for a fact was false because I had painted that room alone at 11 at night with a true crime podcast playing through one earbud so I wouldn't wake the neighbors. I sat down at my own kitchen table with the letter still in my hand, and I laughed, one sharp, confused sound. And then I stopped laughing because I understood what I was actually looking at. This wasn't really a legal claim in any serious sense. It couldn't be. But it also wasn't nothing, and the fact that she'd spent real money on a real attorney to formalize this told me something about how far she was willing to go, not to win the house back, but to make sure I understood that in her mind, ownership on paper had never been the whole story, and she intended to write herself back into it by any available means. I called Arnav that same evening, my hands not quite steady as I read the letter to him over the phone. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a pause long enough that I asked if he was still there. "I'm here," he said. "I'm just deciding how gently to tell you this is almost nothing." He explained that an equitable interest claim, in our state, required something far more substantial than photographs of a mother helping paint a hallway or buying groceries for a new parent. It typically required evidence of a genuine, documented financial partnership in the purchase or maintenance of the property, something closer to a joint investment than casual family assistance. "People help each other," he said. "Courts know the difference between help and ownership. Your mother's attorney knows that too, which tells me this letter isn't really designed to win in court. It's designed to scare you into a settlement before it ever gets that far." Even knowing that, even trusting Arnav completely, I didn't sleep well for the better part of a week. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being legally threatened by your own mother. A specific flavor of unreality where you keep waiting to wake up from a dream where the person who raised you decided the courts were a reasonable next step in a disagreement about a spare bedroom. I found myself double and triple checking my own paperwork at 2 a.m, Theo asleep in the next room, spreading 4 years of mortgage statements across my dining table like evidence in my own defense, even though nobody had asked me to. What she didn't expect, what I don't think she'd ever bothered to consider, because it had simply never occurred to her that I might need to protect myself from her specifically, was that I'd kept better records than she had. I had 4 years of mortgage statements in my name alone, every single one. I had the original wire transfer confirmation from my grandmother's estate, routed directly into escrow with my name as the sole recipient, dated and stamped by the title company. I had every renovation receipt from the last 4 years, filed by year in an accordion folder I'd started almost as a joke, back when I thought I was just being a responsible homeowner and not building a legal case against my own family. I had every permit pulled under my name with the county. I had contractor invoices addressed to me and me alone, including, notably, zero record of any $200 cash payment to anyone for supervisory labor on a nursery I had painted by myself. Arnav drafted a 2-page response, calm and almost clinical in tone, laying out precisely why none of what my mother's letter alleged rose to any legal threshold under state property law, and reminding her attorney, professionally but unmistakably, that continuing to pursue the claim would generate legal fees for her, with no plausible path to an actual outcome attached to them. He sent it, and then we waited. The 3 weeks that followed were some of the strangest of my life, because I was simultaneously caring for an infant, working full inspection shifts, and waiting for a response to a legal letter my own mother had sent me. My Aunt Renata called partway through that stretch, clearly having heard something through the family grapevine, though not the full story, and asked carefully whether everything was okay. I told her the truth, all of it, because I was tired of managing everyone else's comfort around my own mother's behavior. Renata went quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then said something I hadn't expected. "Your grandmother used to say Carol collects people the way other people collect furniture. She likes knowing where everyone is and what they're worth to her." I asked why she'd never said that to me before. She said, honestly, that she'd been afraid of what it would cost her and the family to say it out loud, and that watching what I'd just done, refusing to move, documenting everything, standing firm even under legal threat, had made her ashamed of how long she'd stayed quiet herself. The claim disappeared within 3 weeks of Arnav's response. No further letters, no follow-up calls, nothing. I later learned from Renata, who'd heard it secondhand from my mother herself, in a moment of rare, unguarded frustration, that Gregory Paulson had apparently told my mother privately and directly that she didn't have a case, that pursuing it further would cost her significantly more than the house was worth, just to prove a point that legally could not be proven, and that continuing down that road risked damaging whatever relationship still existed between her and me beyond any possible repair. I want to be honest about how the whole episode actually landed for me. Because it wasn't triumph, not really, even though by every practical measure I had won something. It was grief, mostly. It's one thing to know, abstractly, in the vague, theoretical way you know most uncomfortable truths about your family, that your mother sees your life and your choices as resources that ultimately belong to her plans rather than to you. It is an entirely different thing to hold a formal legal document, printed on letterhead, where she paid an actual attorney real money to attempt to formalize that belief into something enforceable. I cried in my car in a grocery store parking lot the afternoon Arnav called to tell me the claim had been fully and finally withdrawn. Not because I'd won anything worth celebrating, but because winning had required me to prove, methodically, with 4 years of paperwork, that my own mother did not actually see me as a separate person from her own ambitions for the family. Marcus called me the same week the claim disappeared, and it was clear from the first sentence of the call that he hadn't known about the letter at all. Our mother hadn't told him, which told me something important on its own. That even she understood, on some level, how the whole thing would look to him if he knew before it was resolved. When I explained what had happened, laying it out plainly the way I'd learned to over the past 2 months, there was a long silence on the line, long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. "She tried the same thing with my ex-wife's parents," he finally said, his voice quieter than I'd heard it in years. "Years ago. Over the down payment on our old place. She told them she'd contributed more than she actually had, tried to get a say in decisions about the house that weren't hers to make. I never told you about it, because I was embarrassed it had worked on me for as long as it did, before I finally shut it down." That conversation cracked something open between us that 4 years of stiff holiday dinners and surface-level phone calls hadn't managed to touch. We talked for almost an hour and a half that night, longer than we'd spoken in years, about our mother, about the version of our childhood he remembered versus the version I remembered, about how being cast as the difficult one and the easy one, respectively, had cost us both in ways neither of us had ever actually said out loud to each other, even though we'd lived it side by side our entire lives. He told me, somewhat hesitantly, that he'd started seeing a therapist after the move-out, mostly to work through the divorce and the job loss, but that our mother's name kept surfacing in sessions in ways he hadn't anticipated or particularly wanted. I used to think you had it easier, he admitted at one point, because she never seemed to worry about you. I didn't understand until pretty recently that not worrying about someone and not using them are two completely different things. And she was doing the second one to you the whole time, just quietly enough that nobody noticed, including you. Over the following months, something genuinely new started to grow between my brother and me. Something I hadn't let myself hope for, given how our entire relationship had been shaped by our mother's constant positioning of us against each other's needs. It wasn't the old dynamic anymore, where he represented the crisis and I represented the solution. It became something closer to an actual friendship, built slowly, on its own terms. He and the boys started coming over most Sundays, first hesitantly, almost like they were testing whether the invitation was real, and then with the easy regularity of people who'd simply decided this was now a normal part of the week. My nephews adored Theo in the specific, slightly rough way that older cousins adore a baby who can't yet fight back. Hovering over his swing, narrating his every gurgle to anyone who would listen, fiercely protective the one time a neighbor's dog got too close in the backyard. I'd catch Marcus watching the three of them sprawled across the living room floor on those Sunday afternoons, with an expression on his face I didn't immediately have a name for, until I finally recognized it as relief. The exact same quiet, bone-deep relief I'd felt the night I first called Arnav, and realized I wasn't as trapped as I'd believed. Marcus told me, on one of those Sundays, sitting on my back porch while the kids chased each other around the yard, that he'd finally understood something about our mother that he hadn't let himself fully see before, even after everything. "She's not evil," he said carefully, like he was still working the idea out as he spoke it. "I really don't think she is. I think she genuinely, actually believes that love and ownership are the same thing. That if she helped raise you, fed you, showed up when you needed her, some part of your life still belongs on her balance sheet permanently, like a debt that never fully clears, no matter how much you've already paid toward it." I told him that was probably the single most accurate description of our mother I had ever heard from anyone, including the therapists I'd occasionally consulted myself over the years, and that understanding the shape of her belief didn't mean either of us actually owed her the debt she believed we did. My mother, for her part, went quiet for almost 5 months after the legal claim collapsed. Not apologetic. I want to be very clear about that, because this was never going to be the kind of story where she shows up one day fully transformed, having seen the error of her ways in some tidy, satisfying arc. She simply stopped escalating. No calls, no messages through Renata, no more attempts to characterize the situation to distant relatives at family gatherings I wasn't invited to. For a while, I genuinely didn't know whether the silence meant she'd finally accepted something or was simply regrouping. And I found I didn't have the energy to spend guessing which. The letter, when it eventually came, arrived almost exactly 5 months after the legal claim had been withdrawn, and it was shorter than I expected, and stranger than I'd hoped for. 2 pages in her careful, old-fashioned handwriting, mostly about her garden, which had apparently struggled that summer, and about Marcus's new apartment, which she described in more detail than she'd ever described anything of mine. It was, on its surface, exactly the kind of surface-level report she always gave when she wanted contact, without any real accountability attached to it. But underneath the small talk about tomato blight and Marcus's new couch, there was one line near the bottom of the second page that did all of the actual work of the letter. "I still think you could have made more room for family, But Marcus tells me the boys are happy at your house on Sundays, and I suppose that matters more than I let myself admit at the time. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to one. And I want to be honest that reading it didn't magically dissolve 2 months of legal threats and 40 years of accumulated pattern. But it was the first sentence I had ever received from my mother in my entire life that admitted, even sideways and grudgingly, that a version of happiness existing outside her original plan for how things should go might still count as a legitimate good outcome. I read the letter twice at my kitchen table, folded it along its original creases, and put it in the same drawer where I kept the deed and the copy of the withdrawn legal claim, because all 3 documents were true, factual records of the exact same year, and none of them, I decided, actually required a response from me. I did eventually respond anyway, 3 weeks later, though not with a letter. I sent an invitation instead, small, handwritten, nothing dramatic, to Theo's first birthday, a modest gathering in my backyard, everyone welcome, no strings and no obligations attached to the invitation itself. I debated for days whether to include her at all, going back and forth so many times that Priya finally told me, gently, that I was allowed to invite someone to a party without that invitation meaning I'd forgiven everything that had happened between us. So I sent it. My mother came. She arrived a little early, actually, holding a gift wrapped with more care than I remembered her putting into anything in years. And for the first hour of the party, she stood slightly apart from the main group near the fence, watching Marcus's boys chase Theo's escaped balloon across the grass, with the kind of careful, cataloging attention she brought to most family gatherings. At some point, without any particular announcement, she came and sat down next to me on the porch steps, and for a while neither of us said very much of anything at all. We didn't resolve 4 decades of an ingrained family pattern in one backyard birthday party, and I don't think either of us expected to. But she held Theo for a while that afternoon, gently, without a single word of commentary about nurseries or guest rooms or anyone's obligations to anyone else. And when she finally handed him back to me, flushed and a little sticky with frosting from where the boys had shared their cake with him against everyone's better judgment, she said, quietly, almost like she hadn't fully intended to say it out loud, "He looks like you did at that age." It wasn't everything. It wasn't close to a full accounting of what had happened over those first hard weeks of Theo's life, or an acknowledgement of the letter her attorney had sent, or a real apology for any of it. But it was something, a small, real, unscripted moment that hadn't been engineered or leveraged toward any particular outcome. And after everything else that had happened that year, I'd learned to recognize the value of something small and real when it actually showed up. That night, after everyone had left and I'd finally gotten Theo down for the evening, I sat alone in my quiet living room and thought about how strange it was that the house itself, the actual physical structure I'd spent 4 years of evenings and weekends restoring, the deed I'd fought so hard to protect, the walls I understood better than almost anyone because of my job, had never really been the point of any of this. Buildings, I know better than most people, are only ever as strong as their foundations, and foundations are rarely visible from the outside. What had almost collapsed that year wasn't a structure made of drywall and mortgage payments. It was the unspoken agreement my entire family had operated under for decades. The belief that some of us existed to give, and some of us existed to receive, and that questioning which category you'd been assigned to was itself a kind of betrayal. I looked in on my son before I went to bed that night, over a year old by then, asleep on his back with one fist curled near his ear, the exact way I apparently used to sleep, according to the one photograph my mother had ever shown me from my own infancy. And I said the thing out loud, quietly, in my own empty hallway, that I'd needed to hear in my own voice for a long time. The house was never really the point, and neither was the legal claim that ultimately went nowhere, or the letter, or even the birthday party. The point, the whole point, was that somebody in this family had finally had to be the one to say no, clearly, in writing, with a folder of proof sitting ready in a drawer just in case. Not in order to win some private contest against my mother, but simply to make it structurally impossible for anyone to keep quietly rewriting the story of who I was allowed to be within it. Once that single fact stopped being negotiable, once I'd proven, on paper and in practice, that my life belonged to me and not to whoever needed it most urgently that week, everything else in the family finally had room to become something closer to honest, even if it never became anything close to perfect. If you take one thing away from this story, let it be this: help that requires you to disappear from your own address was never actually help. And love that only functions correctly when you stay silent was never really love to begin with. It was simply an unpaid position with unusually good branding attached to it. Build your name onto your own paperwork first, before anyone else has the chance to quietly build themselves into it instead. Keep your records long after you're convinced you'll never need them, because the people who love to rewrite history rarely announce their intentions in advance. And don't ever mistake someone finally backing down for someone finally understanding what they did. Those are two very different victories, and only one of them is guaranteed to actually last over time. Everything else in a family, including who ultimately gets to walk through your front door and under what terms, follows from that same quiet, unglamorous, thankless work of documenting your own life as though someone might eventually try to rewrite it. Because in families like mine, eventually, someone usually does. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Quiet Reckonings and tell me in the comments what boundary you finally had to put in writing yourself. I read every single one. Until next time, keep your locks changed and your receipts organized.